Okay, everybody, hello, and welcome to the Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I am ready to bring you another great conversation. My guest today is Tom DePaola. He is the co-author of a book called The Gig Academy, Mapping Labor in the Neoliberal University, and I know a lot of people who listen to this show will recognize those terms. Maybe many of you are living the gig academy and its connection to the larger gig economy. The idea that full-time employment and secure full-time employment with, a good wages and benefits and knowing that you're going to have that job next year is something that very few people get anymore in any sector of the economy. But we're academics and we're talking about that part. And part of the reason I tell my story often is not to say, poor me, please pity me. It's more to say, like, look, I know what it's like out there, and if this is what I'm experiencing as like a white dude with a Ph.D., what the fuck are other people experiencing all over the country? I mean, this is a rotten fucking economy. People will, by the indication, the stock market is higher than it's ever been. But people are suffering, and I think that that's something that is reflected even in the rise of Bernie Sanders and stuff like that. So, and even in the rise of Trump, honestly. So, it's a really shitty economic situation, and our experience as academics in the university is emblematic of that. And I think, as we kind of talk about in this show with Tom, there is potential there. There is opportunity there. There is a future of cross-class solidarity, and I mean like academics and non-academics, tenured and non-tenured, people getting together and realizing that their interests are the same because they're being all of us are being attacked by these institutions. So I'll give you an example of how that's playing out in my life right now. I had some tweets a couple weeks ago about what's going on at the University of La Verne, where I am an adjunct. I've been teaching there for 2 years. I teach U.S. history and government. I don't think I'll be teaching there anymore, probably. We got an email in November, a shocking email that just was labeled, the subject of the email, this is not good. When the subject of the email is adjunct compensation, it's not going to be like, hey, we're going to give you more money. Instead, what that email said was shocking. It said that the University of La Verne, our administration, has used our lawyers to find a loophole in California labor law. And we've checked with our lawyers, and this is totally legal. We're now allowed to pay adjunct instructors as hourly waged employees. This absolutely devastates our ability as adjuncts to survive. And the attack coming like right at the holidays, at the end of the semester, was kind of unbelievable and outrageous. And it was followed up by some other stuff that's going on at the school that, again, I don't know a whole lot about because I'm kind of at a satellite campus on a military base. It's a long story. And this is all part of like the weird kind of life you live as an itinerant instructor at colleges wherever you can find a job. But the La Verne thing is dried up essentially because they've destroyed the jobs. And at this point, I don't even know what's going on. I know that the tenured faculty also are experiencing unbelievable shit, like the law school at La Verne. They closed it, renamed it, and stripped tenure from a bunch of the faculty there. And that's what led to the tenured faculty kind of joining with the adjuncts to vote no confidence. And what something hilarious that happened right before the no confidence vote is we all got an email from the school chaplain, which said, hey, I wish that you wouldn't vote no confidence in the administration. I wish we could all find some way to like kind of pray through this. And this is bad for the spirit of the school for there to be a labor fight, which is unfucking believable. I'm sorry. So like, we're in a shitty situation and it's getting worse and worse. And the idea that tenured faculty are this kind of elite that are kind of immune to the attacks from the administration, I don't think that's going to hold. I don't think, tenured faculty, I think a lot of them are skeptical of joining with adjuncts because, they don't want to lose their kind of situation. We talk about this, $100,000 a year and benefits will shut a fucking tenured faculty up about labor. It really will. I mean, that's just the honest truth. But as they attack tenured faculty too, you begin to see a kind of cross-class solidarity among faculty. And even more important than that is cross-class solidarity with the other workers at the university who are being fucked over even worse. And I'm talking about janitorial staff and food workers, so many different bits of the kind of economy of the university. All of that is, being contracted out. I mean, there's a lot of details to this. And Tom DePaola, my guest today, he has a lot of like the kind of practical knowledge and the historical data to kind of back up what's been going on basically for the last several decades, and how we've landed now in the 21st century with an academy and a labor situation in the universities that's totally outrageous, totally unsustainable, and we need to start figuring out ways to attack back. And I'm that kind of guy that's like, this shit feels like real personal to me. I barely scrape by as an adjunct. So when you change my compensation to the point where I can't make money to survive, that's attacking my ability to eat and feed my family, etc., etc. It makes me feel a rage that I do not know what to do with. And all of this is to say nothing about the students, which is what the whole fucking school is supposed to be about, and who I feel most bad for when I think about these issues, because, you see the posters that say like, teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions. That's absolutely right. And our students have really no idea the like horrific labor conditions at the school they're going to, and all of this trickles into their lives and their experience of the school and their experience of education. And, for those of us who got into teaching college, I think that was what the whole bit was about. Beyond our research, beyond our like academic contributions, I want to teach like that more than anything. I mean, honestly, fuck my academic contributions. No one's going to give me a tenured job to really keep researching and be paid to research. So teaching is really what I do. And the students matter to me. Like that to me is something important. And I know that a lot of you out there that are teachers know that and feel that too. So the students are suffering, and this is also the economy that they're graduating into. So it's something that's really, really important to think about when we think about the whole health of the university and how it connects to the larger society. Okay, so I'm not going to keep ranting because the shit makes me so mad. But this is the kind of situation where we're in when we got to do something about it. And this is a great conversation with Tom. I hope you enjoy it. Again, the book is called The Gig Academy, Mapping Labor in the Neoliberal University. And this is a part of a much larger kind of economic nightmare that we're living in the 21st century, that if we don't push back against, I mean, honestly, I think it's all in the politics already. This is the fact that we're living so precariously is why Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are popular for their own, different kind of cultural reasons too. But either way, this is a really, really important moment, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. You can find more Nostalgia Trap stuff all over the place. We've been talking about this for years, and I think we're going to continue talking about it. But nostalgiatrap.com is where all of our stuff is. And if you can support our show, I mean, I need it more than ever before. If you got $5 a month to give to the show, we're going to continue tracking this story and building a kind of historical and also forward-looking attitude about what we're doing, because I want this show to have some to connect with the real issues that we're all facing. So if you can contribute, that would be great. We're at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And we've got bonus episodes and other cool stuff for the people that subscribe. And thank you to the people who are already subscribing. It means everything to me when I see an email that says I've got a new patron. It like really makes me feel good. It makes me feel that there are people out there that know that we're trying very hard to address these issues that are really our whole lives. Okay, so I hope you enjoy this episode. This is me talking with Tom DePaola. All right, so Tom DePaola, thanks so much for joining me. You're someone who has participated in the writing of a book called The Gig Academy that I think a lot of people who listen to the Nostalgia Trap will know a little bit of what you're talking about when you say the words Gig Academy. But can you maybe start us off a little bit? First of all, hello, how are you? And also, can you start us off a little bit, like telling us what this concept of the Gig Academy is, and maybe kind of like how the book came about, because I know it came about as a project out of the Academy.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks so much for having me. This is a sort of fulfillment of a minor fantasy, since this is like actually one of my favorite podcasts, and part of that is genuinely because you're one of the very few people I think who talk about the problems in higher ed with like the right nuance, particularly the labor issues. And I'm sure we'll sort of get into that and like the way that we try to sort of, focus on like the power problems and workplace democracy at the end of the book, is really like trying to get at, I think, where like a lot of the failures in the discourse are that like you and some others like Max Alvarez have long, talked about. So, but the Gig Academy is, the project was sort of to take stock of, if you try to take stock of the overall academic discourse around, the neoliberal university and like corporatization, we had the sense that it was still sort of mired in these increasingly sort of like outdated ways of sort of discreetly packaging different issues and focusing on individual strata of workers within the university setting. And the one of the more famous books that sort of initiated a lot of this, Academic Capitalism and the New Economy. I mean, that was written 20 years ago, and they were, Slaughter and Rhodes. They would talk about a lot of how the academy was restructuring, and it was focusing more on, market seeking kinds of activities. And it was about how, since 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act, and universities were newly able to profit off of their intellectual property, and how they, were trying to interface more and more with the business world, and it was more sort of outward seeking, and we wanted to take more of an inward seeking look and really like unpack how the university has been restructuring its own labor force and just academic production in general. And the thing is, like when Academic Capitalism was written, they talk about it as an ascendant, regime. It was still sort of emerging, and they saw the academic capitalist regime as being sort of fundamentally in tension with this residual, public good regime that was still sort of, like keeping that dialectic. And so, there was a way to kind of, try to appeal to the people who still like bought into the public good ideas. And the thing is, like now, it's become totally hegemonic. Like there is no, we've had 20 years or more of like intense academic capitalism, and now this is just how the machine works.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we lament on this show is the loss of that public good element, right? And it seems like that's the part of it that is in some ways the nostalgia trap for us, which is like, this idea that there was this kind of like perfect university at one point, but at the same time something has changed, and like what you're identifying is something dramatic. I hadn't heard of that. Well, can you talk a little bit about what is that act in 1980 that like changed the way, because that sounds like the actual like practical kind of mechanics of how we talk. I mean, people talk about the quote unquote neoliberal university a lot. And that word neoliberalism has become, a big buzzword online. And I think a lot of people kind of misunderstand exactly what it means, but it sounds like that act in 1980 has something to do with kind of explaining that.
Yeah, well, so the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, came like right at the start of the kind of, Reagan era. And it was, as a lot of public disinvestment was happening in higher ed, and as colleges were sort of like struggling to, figure out how to, fix their budgets, the Congress decided, rather than like, continue to fund at adequate levels, they would just allow universities to profit off of their intellectual property, right? Whereas before, a lot of the work that universities did, a lot of the research and the things that they produced through that research that was funded with, public money, ended up sort of by default being the property of the government. And this is because, for many decades, it was largely the U.S. military that was funding research.
Right.
The golden age of higher ed, right, is not something we want to go back to for several reasons. But at least one of them is that, like, as bad as it is, to be so beholden to, all of these like large, shadowy corporate entities, like it's not actually that much better for it to have been the lackey of the U.S. military. So. Right.
It was a Cold War. In a lot of ways, higher education became a Cold War project during that era. And you see that even with the purging of communists and even like left liberals from the university. Yeah.
And that's a really important point too, because for all the like lamenting of the loss of academic freedom, and all of these ideals, right? It's not like academics really stood up for their colleagues during the red baiting days. And, they didn't even use the freedom that they had, even when it was more robust, right? And it was more the standard for faculty. So,
So 20 years after,
the nostalgia traps are real.
Yeah. So now it's been 40 years since that the Bayh-Dole Act.
Right.
So 40 years seems like long enough time to actually nail down exactly what you're talking about, which is that kind of that kind of transition from thinking about the academy as one thing and to thinking about it another way. And it feels like you see that everywhere in the kind of like larger attitudes about what college is, you know, like many people, young people included, think that college is just a big scam and a ripoff and something that's just going to take a lot of money from you, put you in debt, and not really deliver anything to you. In other words, with the public good element gone from it, and it's just a capitalist exchange, a lot of people are making different it really changed the kind of cultural attitude about what college is, which is horrific, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And shifting that framework so that we started to think of college as this like, you know, fee for service kind of experience where, you know, you leave with this, you know, human capital that you then take to trade in at the market for like your stable career. And that, you know, somehow we need to like just like keep like retooling like how we're educating people in order to fix these labor market outcomes, when that's obviously not, you know, that's not the site of intervention that is the most meaningful. You know, the labor force is restructuring, and, you know, we can't sort of act into that situation by, you know, trying to, you know, convince people that, you know, if colleges do this or that thing better, then like, like somehow, you know, your graduates will end up having a stable life, because there's just, you know, fewer and fewer domains in which you can make a living wage at all.
Yeah.
And that's the point. And academia, of course, is
one of them. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about your experience of this, because I mean, for many of us, you know, this was a process of learning about the academy as we were getting degrees. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, like we've talked about many times on this show, the phenomenon, and it's something that I hear a lot from my students, like this, they're using the phrase first gen to talk about their experience, but like first generation college students, right? People who haven't been through these institutions. And that was certainly my experience. I didn't really, I didn't come from a family that was super academic. So in other words, it was a process of learning what this was. And I think in many ways it still is. I'm still learning. I think part of the podcast is that. But what was it for you? What was that experience for you? In other words, at what point did you enter into the university? At what point do you begin to like think about the university in like a meta way?
Well, I sort of had always been thinking about it, but it's only after I came to a place like USC that I feel like I had a good lay of the land in terms of institutional type. I went to SUNY Purchase.
Yeah.
And studied lit and philosophy as an undergrad. And, you know, SUNY Purchase is an interesting place. And, you know, it was a very cool sort of like art school, where people were known for being weird and all this stuff. But
this is an upstate New York school, right?
Yeah, it's in Westchester.
Oh, so it's close to the city.
Yeah, it's outside of White Plains.
Yeah.
But I guess the point is, you know, I had faculty, my advisors and other faculty were people that you had, you know, genuine like mentor-mentee relationships with. And because it was like a state school, and because there certainly is still pressure to publish and do other like scholarly prestigious things, but it's far lower than it is at an R1. And, you know, so I was exposed to this kind of like increasingly bygone ideal of what, you know, college, you know, development was like, because, you know, I had these real relationships to kind of like marshal my intellect. And I didn't realize, I guess, that wasn't the norm until many years later. After college, I sort of lucked into a job at Bronx Community College. And I worked there for 5 years, mostly as a like academic advisor and administrator. But I also started to teach as an adjunct after a little while. I like finagled my way into the first year program, and I was teaching, you know, these 1 credit courses to new students that were designed to sort of like introduce them to college level work, and you could sort of build it around any theme you wanted. So I like built the, like just for fun. I only had a BA, and it was like I was building this class around teaching them about like the history of the Bronx and like hip hop and like looking at like new Jim Crow and like the war on drugs, like all this stuff. And it was great because I was mostly teaching criminal justice students.
Nice.
And my MO was really just to do everything I could to try to like derail, to like inspire them to look into like alternative careers besides being a cop or a immigration officer.
Yeah,
or,
yeah. So this is CUNY, right? Is it like?
So that was CUNY, and I loved BCC. I loved the students. It was fascinating to see like how dedicated like everybody was, but because it was such a it was an underfunded place, obviously, and people were spread really thin, and a lot of the departmental politics were really toxic. But I was sort of fascinated with this idea that like this is like the one institution where the majority of the students here are actually like local, like they're like you have this like underutilized collective of people who are from the area, right, who are from like the University Heights and the surrounding neighborhoods in the Bronx and like Washington Heights, and like that seemed like a really like untested store of potential political power, and trying like what would it mean for an urban community college to sort of like take advantage of that in ways that like help students basically like fight their own oppression, fight gentrification, like these other things. So that's where I sort of got really interested in like urban political economy and how higher ed interfaces with that, and
it's such
labor issues.
It's such you're right about the CUNY. So I taught at CUNY for 14 years at Baruch College, which is CUNY. For those that don't know, CUNY has got a representation or a reputation for being the school that kind of is the working class school of New York City, and the place where working class kids go and get educations that raise them into the middle class. At least that's the brand, that's right. The kind of CUNY promise. And so I like what you're saying there, because I feel like I always felt the same way about CUNY students. They were like this. They had this like force of amazing potential. These like local New York working class students coming from immigrant populations, coming from very, very diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. Like really, really just an incredible set of students. And I was always wary of exactly what you're saying. Like because Baruch is a business school, so like all of them were business majors. All of them wanted to like go to Wall Street. And so that's really hard to be like a leftist person or a radical, whatever. And like, not even leftist, human being, dude, where you're kind of like, I'm teaching them stuff very similar to because I was teaching history at this school. So I'm teaching like hip hop, we probably taught a lot of the same material. And like, and that's because, you want to like connect with their like kind of cultural sensibilities, but also like teach them a little bit of the history of it and like tell them like, look, you're part of this story. And like, you're part of this kind of like longer kind of journey to discover what all this is about. But yeah, it's tricky because the CUNY is a professional. It's professionalism that you're doing. You're not really. That's not really the mission of the school. That was us being subversive almost.
Indeed, and it was something that I had to be sensitive about because the fact that so many students wanted to be wanted to get a B or an AA in criminal justice and then transfer to John Jay to finish out their BA and then go to the police academy. Like it was because this is in the aftermath of the recession. Like this was within 5 years of the end of the recession, there was still not a lot of options, and the police in New York City are basically like an occupying army, and it's a solid career, and you could hardly blame folks for wanting to like throw their efforts into something that seemed like a relatively sure bet,
Totally. You're right. It is like joining the military in the sense that the NYPD is always there. They're always hiring. You could always go, and it feels like if you're a young person with a certain degree of capabilities, you could apply and get that job. And not only get that job, but it's materially the benefit. The union of the police, they've done very well for themselves. That's like insane. You get a good retirement, you get good benefits, and you're right. There is a material kind of draw to that you can't really blame people for going after that, and that's why restructuring the society is so important.
Right. Yeah. But at the time, my goal was just like, okay, I want to like try to like awaken these folks to like a lot of the like structural racism in law enforcement, and also alert them that there's like sort of a whole other world of work that is adjacent to the criminal justice system that isn't, you know, law enforcement. And so I tried to, you know, I started like an internship program, and like fought to actually like pay the students who participated. And I was like placing them with like Bronx defenders and like activist like law firms and like other places where I thought that they would get exposed to like, you know, cool, interesting work that is like on the right side of, you know, a lot of justice issues. And, you know, for what it's worth, it worked. Like at least some of those students ended up not going into law enforcement and going into other things. But I miss those students, and I miss that setting because it was like such a shock to then come, right? Like having never been on an R1 campus, you know, much less one that is, you know, sort of like a giant country club the way that USC is. I mean, it was really jarring. And tell me about
your decision to go to USC. What made you decide to go? You're getting like a Ph.D. in education, I assume.
Yeah. So the program is technically an urban education policy program, and that you know, actually the CUNY Grad Center is one of the very few only other institutions that has you know, a degree in urban education that isn't. And even the ones that do are often just about K-12 schools. And there's actually, I mean, the K-12 scholarship has been sort of ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about like how schools fit into like the problems of gentrification and uneven development in cities. And so you have some radical scholars who have written about that for a long time. In higher ed, that's not the case at all. And I guess I'd like to come back to that topic. But,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, because the Gig Academy is entirely about higher education, but it seems like, you know, there's a bigger story going on in that kind of, I don't know, the world of education generally.
Yeah, and the connections between labor restructuring and spatial reorganization, right? Like these things are actually sort of go hand in glove in ways that I think are like really underappreciated. But
so the reason go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say the reason I was attracted to USC was sort of precisely because they had what seemed to be this, you know, very interdisciplinary you know, approach to education policy that would, you know, allow you to, you know, and this is what I want to do. I wanted to think about gentrification and higher ed. And at the time, I cared a lot about community college, the open access movement, and I wanted to study like remediation in community colleges as this like, you know, really fucked up form of oppression. And I sort of went into that at first, and then I kind of realized like actually there are a lot of good people sort of working on this issue already, and I ended up getting more into the labor stuff. I mean, so what I'll say is that I was actually disappointed, and I'll admit to being disappointed because to their credit, the program has significantly retooled its curriculum so that it does give a little like a more kind of like, you know, focus on urban issues generally. But when I arrived, it was just a conventional education policy program, and the urban stuff was really much more about, you know, that it sort of sounded cool. And it took the students kind of organizing and pressuring the school to you know, actually sort of make good on the way that they had wanted to design that program. But, you know, the problem was that, you know, all the faculty were still just, you know, these like rock star scholars in their particular, you know, niches. And so there wasn't this sense that like people were thinking across disciplines. And I don't know, like having come from like a lit and philosophy background, and like, you know, I wanted to like think about, you know, a lot of things outside the very, you know, particular education issues that people seem to gravitate towards. So anyway, I ended up, you know, starting to really like gravitate more toward the labor issues. You talked about sort of like having to discover for yourself like how bad things are, and that was like really the case. You know, I think the really sad thing about grad school for a lot of people is that, you know, when you get into a fully funded PhD, Even with a modest living stipend, right? That's not nowhere near a living wage, often, given the cities that they're in.
Totally.
You think that you've like made it. You think that like on some level, like, okay, like I got like made it through this filter. Like, these programs are incredibly selective.
Mm-hmm.
And you get in and you're like, all right, I made it. If I don't mess this up, right? Like there is stability and security waiting for me on the other side of this. And then, if you are a first gen, especially like grad student, and you aren't accustomed to a lot of the structures of academia, it's a lot of pressure. It's super intense. It's very hard on your mental and physical health. It's very easy to just like sacrifice yourself in like tremendous ways for the first couple of years, and then it's after you've sunk all of this effort and time and blood, sweat, and tears into this that you realize that, oh no, actually there is like this is just the start of the rat race. Like there is no like pot of gold at the end of the rainbow here. Like if I survive this, it's just to sort of like push a new boulder up a hill in trying to finagle a way into a tenure track job. And even if you make it somehow through that filter, right, you've still got like another 5-6 years of having to just be insanely productive and teach a full load and do all it right. And
it's impossible. I mean, honestly, like, and at a certain point, you're just kind of like, I mean, again, I'm further along than you in the sense of like I finished my PhD in 2013, and so it's been 7 years. The idea of a full-time tenure track job is a long dead dream, pretty much to me. It's like the best I can do is hopefully arrange some sort of like adjuncting that it has some sort of employment, like a lot of schools will give you some sort of like certificate of employment, of continuous employment. So it's not quite tenure, but you have some sort of job security. And that's, I think a lot of people that are in PhD programs should know that like maybe the best thing you can find as an alternative to tenure track teaching, if you want to teach, is teaching tons of classes at one university where they guarantee that you'll have classes every semester. And like that is a kind of shitty solution. And I mean, it's not really a solution, but it's where I'm at. And then my other advice to you, dude, is start a podcast and a Patreon, because that's what PhDs do.
Yeah, I've thought about it.
Dude, it's like the fact that we're talking about this like this way is insane, because it's like for history, I mean, my discipline at this, there are just hundreds and hundreds of PhDs graduating each year into a market that has like 2 jobs in it. You do the math, you're like, well, that means that basically we have this like huge, you talk about untapped potential. We have this huge like army of thousands of people with PhDs with nothing to do with them, or living kind of marginal academic existences. Yeah,
and God, history. The stats in that discipline in particular are so sad of how when you look at the line graphs and also there was a recent study about how like the family income of history majors is like spiking because like working class folks are sort of abandoning it out of necessity, or out of perceived necessity, right?
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, it's a harsh realization, and I think that it was magnified for me in part because I sort of felt like this like Cassandra or something, while everyone else, because everyone is studying their own thing. They're studying like district level policy, toward like charter schools or whatever. They're studying there's particular things, but I happen to study.
I know, that's so depressing.
Labor.
Is that depressing to you, honestly? Because like your book that you wrote with 2 other people, and we can get into the mechanics of that. But your book, the Gig Academy, and the work that you're doing in graduate school is literally about like surveying and cataloging the like awful job market that you're going to graduate into. It's like you're studying your own kind of your own kind of like irrelevance, and like that shit is just, dude. That I don't know how you handle that.
And yeah, well, I'm not sure either. I mean, it's sort of like, I'm at this point now where I'm nearing the end, and it's like, okay, I have to like go into the fire that I've been like,
Yeah.
screaming about for years. And I don't know, like it's very hard to accept that way forward. And so without anyway, like getting in too far into like musings about my own future plans, I did want to return. So it is, all right. So the way that, academic labor is exploited is obviously like really key. And like, for what it's worth, like adjunctification is like more of a household term now than like ever in the past. There was not a lot of talk around this in the kind of mainstream until very recently. And that's definitely good. But part of the point is to say like, this is actually even like, it's bigger than that. Like it's the entire university that has been restructured so that, you have, flexible production and accumulation processes. And that's why like the gig economy is this sort of like, construct that, we would use to label the current reality. It's more about like looking, right. It's a pun drawing on the gig economy, because the gig economy as this kind of, this sort of catch-all term for like the post-industrial hellscape that we live in, right, is sort of implicitly contrasted with, the new economy. And when you think about like, the like Clinton era and the early aughts, when it was like, oh, like technology is going to, computers and the internet are going to like, create this like whole like bustling, vibrant, prosperous future for all of us. And we've been, since then, now that like all of those, nascent things have matured into, this like terrible, like where it's all just like, rentist platforms and surveillance and data mining and, all these things that like
Uber. It's like really like that. Yeah. I trace when I think of what you're talking about. I mean, this was the 90s was the era that I was in high school. And like I totally was subjected to that propaganda from the culture, which was that tech was the future and tech was really where like everyone was going to be working and making a lot of money. And it was and you when you trace that line all the way and end up to Uber, which is what you're, I think, kind of Uber is a company that kind of represents all of those neoliberal trends you just identified, from like data mining and surveillance, all of it. I mean, Uber is just all of that. And it's like, that's what we end up with. Like, in other words, the road to tech with capitalism led us to a more streamlined form of exploitation.
Indeed. And like, techno-feudalism, basically. And that's sort of, what we're trying to do is situate the academy within this larger process, right, of restructuring labor in order, to facilitate, on-demand goods and services with the least friction possible, right? And this is sort of like, it's not a unique problem to academia, and this is why it sort of can't really be fought at an individual level.
Right.
You can't like convince your own institution to abandon the mechanisms that have allowed them to prosper and to like keep their endowment strong and like all these things. Right? You can't just like demand it, because it goes against the what is now the totalizing logic of these institutions, right? And I have no doubt that a lot of people in executive administrations think that they are doing the right moral thing, right, by financializing, all these like aspects of what they do. And
because they've taken for granted that capitalism is the world and that's how it fucking works. And like, you come up against that wall eventually at any institution. I mean, I won't bore you the long story of it, but I once like wrote a letter at a medical company that I was working at. I wrote a letter to the president of the company, like telling him that like that the employees weren't getting paid enough for what they were doing, et cetera, et cetera. I was really young and naive. I like wasn't a union person or anything. I just like wrote this letter on my own. The dude called me into his office and told me that it sounds like you have a problem with capitalism. And I was like, yeah, like basically he's like, well, I don't even know what to say to that. Like, I have no idea. Like, you need to just leave the office. And I was like 20 years old, 21, something like that. And I was just like completely, like, I was naive, but I realized that, oh shit, like the guy's not lying. He's like literally saying like, no, this is the totalizing logic of this institution. Get the fuck out of here with that. Like, this is how it works. And in order to imagine a better world, we have to attack that totalizing logic.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why it kills me. Like, you ever notice how every op-ed about sort of, corporatized higher ed, and I mean, even ones that offer actually like very good nuanced, critiques of like how neoliberalism operates in the academy. The problem is by the end of these articles and op-eds, they sort of, they always shit the bed, and like they never know like how to sort of, gesture
Yes.
toward like where we go.
Well, that's just the way it is. We'll see how it goes.
Well, but the sense you get, like reading it, because as I do, like all of these things that get published in like the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed, and even in like New York Times and stuff, is that, they are writing to some imagined audience of like important stakeholders who, if they can just be reasoned with, that it is in everyone's interest for there to be, secure jobs and as professors with academic freedom and shared governance and all of these things. That like, if you can just like, word your moral appeal in the right way, then like those people will like, do the right thing. And it's like, that doesn't exist. You know what I mean? Like you are not, there's no one meaningful that you're talking to that's going to make that. Like we are the only ones that can do that.
Yeah, and the last part of your book, which we can get to, is part of like kind of imagining how, and I want to get to that too, because it's like I wonder if you've had more contact with people who are actually doing things. You know what I mean? Like people that are and when I say contact or knowledge of people that are actually doing things that are more meaningful than writing those kinds of editorials.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah. So I guess it's trying to focus on this distribution of power and the ways that we can try to create and exploit like fissures within this order. And obviously, like I believe in like organizing and unions and collective action, and we'll sort of get there. But the last thing I wanted to sort of mention about the Gig Academy in general, or at least I wanted to clarify that, so the Gig Academy is this way of analogizing how the orientation toward the new economy changed once we, stopped having, all of our like end of history fantasies and like, techno prosperity, utopianism gave way to the gig economy, language of, just destitution and abject, subjection. The Gig Academy is the equivalent of that, in the higher ed space. And the point is that it's not just, right, you have, of course, like, you have, exploited academic workers, and even within that category, the strata have sort of multiplied in exponential ways. And this is, because, I mean, I know you probably read the Mark Bousquet book, How the University Works, and that is like that has like a really, it was such a prescient book when it was written. And, it very much holds up. And it's this idea that, we are waste built into this system, right? We're literally, he calls it like the excrement theory of graduate education, right?
Ugh.
And it's that, it's that like, you don't actually need to theorize like some overarching, cabal of like higher ed, decision makers who were saying like, oh, well, let's just, start, bringing in many more PhDs than the job market can absorb. Because, and this is what, apologists will say is that, oh, it's just overproduction of PhDs. It's an innocent market failure. And like, that's not true. There is no market. Like it's fictive. Like what is the point then? The demand
if it's
is
not
subject to managerial control.
Right. So what is the point of having what you're saying then is like the kind of like planned waste of the system? Like who benefits? What is the point of that? Why create this kind of mass of contingent academics and PhDs that are unable to find full-time employment?
Because ultimately, like they're very useful if you want to satisfy the sort of like core functions of the university as cheaply as possible, and so that you can devote more resources to speculative things and and real estate and all this other stuff. Like ultimately, if whether you're paying somebody $3,000 to teach a class for one semester, or you're paying a tenured professor like $120,000 a year to teach that same class, right? You're still just getting like 3 people with grade or 30 people with grades, right? Like there's like it doesn't matter. Like there's no kind of, you can't just like convince institutions to start valuing teaching again. You know, that's like another brand of the kind of op-ed that I find really problematic. And like Leonard Casuto at the Chronicle like does this all the time, where he'll suggest things like, oh, you know what, we just need to like create a Yelp for graduate schools. And that way, you know, students can become shrewder consumers of graduate education.
Tech will answer everything.
Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great if we could tie the amount of prestige that a university has to, you know, how well they treat their grad students and how much they value teaching? And it's like, okay, well, that's a nice thought, but like there's the material basis for that like doesn't exist. Like the quality of teaching can never affect, like graduate working conditions can never affect the kinds of like capital flows that it takes to sustain the contemporary university, you know? So it's like,
well, that's the thing is like, I mean, CUNY is notorious for paying really, really low. I mean, they're still, and in fact, for those that know, I mean, CUNY's in a contract negotiation right now, and this PSC union is gonna, I think, approve the new contract, or maybe has already. I'm not following it as closely because I'm not part of CUNY anymore. But when I left there, dude, I was getting $3,200 a course for like full courses, like fucking the whole semester from like August to December, meeting twice a week, preparing those lectures, doing all the assignments. I mean, everything, a full class, $3,200. I had to teach like 3 or 4 of them, you know what I mean? To try to like make it. But either way, that, you know, what you're talking about of like, if they can get away with paying $3,200, and the new contract, I think, raises it up to $45 over the course of 5 years or something. It's something outrageous. It's like, honestly, like when like the demand across the nation is like 7K, like 7,000 a course is like appropriate for adjuncts. But what you're saying that like, and I think I agree with you, like if the university could pay $3,200 a course, like that sets the precedent for them to like, why are they gonna ever, unless they're forced to, like. And
this speaks to the nature, right? So like for, you know, the gig academy operating in the kind of Taylorist model of, you know, scientific management, right? If you have these like rock star faculty that are, you know, garnering you prestige and getting all these grants, like you want them to be doing the things, like as much of the thing that brings in value, you know, as they can. And so, you know, a lot of these faculty like rarely have to teach much, and, you know, and they've been, you know, alleviated of a lot of like other like institutional service like duties that, you know, we once sort of associated with the faculty, like, you know, shared governance stuff. And, you know, administration, you know, one of those things was like, you know, adjunct hiring. And so, you know, the administration was all too happy to take over those functions as, you know, the tenured professoriate, like over time, just like conceded, you know, more and more until they were, you know, such a sort of small island that their political power was virtually nil. And that's sort of where we are. And this is why it doesn't make any sense. Like if you're, you know, a tenured faculty member and you care about academic freedom and shared governance and like the liberal arts and like all these things, like the only thing that your priority should be is standing in solidarity with the contingent faculty. Like that is the only way.
I mean, you know this as well as I do that tenured faculty make 100. You know, if they're making 100K a year, it talks loudly. You know what I mean? And like that kind of job security, that kind of material benefit is hard to overcome when you're talking about people taking risks and upsetting the institution that is supporting them. In other words, like I often wonder about the tenured faculty position because it's more and more, you know, it's a small elite. They're like going to be the 1%ers of the academy at some point. And I'm like, is the in terms of the long-term trend, it seems like tenured faculty would eventually go away completely, but it sounds like they do kind of serve some ideological purpose within the academy. It seems like it maybe the academy will keep a small amount of them around and will kind of stay in this arrangement for a while.
Yeah, well, it's the same way that, like, you know, these tech firms, I mean, take Uber, right? It's like the overwhelming majority of the value created at Uber is done by these, you know, exploited drivers who aren't earning a, you know, living wage and have to like you take on all the like cost risks of working and, you know, all of these things that they're just skimming rent off the top. And, you know, in this case, it's sort of, but Uber also has, you know, a very small contingent of very well-paid, software engineers and other, executive CFOs, right? So there is the highly valued work, right, within this thing, and in higher ed, the highly valued work is getting, is the things that helps people compete for funding and for prestige. And
well, you can it makes sense as a capitalist institution that those stars, those tenured faculty, can then be used to kind of sell the institution's value to people that you're trying to convince to pay massive tuition.
Indeed. But the point I was driving at before is that, it's not just, even though so the way that we are waste, right? As we continue to produce people with PhDs for whom there are no secure jobs, right? What do they end up doing, right? They either become an adjunct or they do postdocs. And of course, the postdoc is another sort of contingent, right? It's these really marginal improvements in working conditions. Postdocs make more than graduate workers, but not by much. And, they have a 2-year or a 3-year appointment, but it's not real security.
No, it's really I did postdocs for 3 years, dude, and it's like that. It was just kind of it was like a grant of 1 more year of graduate school before you get into the real shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people have gotten on university cases because, there are now people are doing more and longer postdocs. I mean, there's the sort of term, the permadoc, people who end up doing postdocs for 10 years. And so then there were people to try to say, okay, well, now we have to restrict, we're going to fix this by restricting the number of postdocs that somebody can do at an institution. But then they just create these new novel strata of contract faculty. And there's no sort of standardized language around this, right? So you can get hired on all of these sort of it's temporary, teaching only appointments, or as contract researchers, who are brought in to just work on particular projects. Even the research work, even the really valuable research work, is sort of getting outsourced to contingent researchers and faculty, while the rock star faculty, continue to sort of oversee and write grants. And, it's infected sort of every area. But, it's easy enough to just then, go from a postdoc to slide into a series of contract faculty appointments that are largely indistinguishable from one another and do not have the security of tenure track. And, and then you're in your 40s, and then you realize, you have no retirement, you have no savings, right? You have nothing. And so this is how people get excreted out of the system, is by eventually, having to bail, unless you have, an independent basis of wealth that you can rely on and just teach for the love of it or whatever. There are definitely career adjuncts who,
that's me,
do
dude.
not care about working conditions.
Yeah.
Well, but who do not care because they've already made their fortune in some business field or
I mean, I'm a career adjunct, and my wife's a teacher too, and we just kind of pool our resources to make it work. That's just how this is how it goes. But she's got a little bit more of a secure situation than I do. But either way, for me, it's. I mean, for both of us, and for me especially, but then just because we're a unit, what that means is we never ever know how much money we're going to make every year or month to month, and so there's no planning, there's no house buying, there's no we're still living like we're in our 20s, kind of renting an apartment, and that part of it is kind of incredible. We both have PhDs, and it's not really exactly what we imagine, and then the other part of me is people are fucked everywhere, and I'm going to be thankful that I'm able to teach and just live a quiet, boring life. And in other words, I've lowered my expectations of what material happiness is. But either way, it's really, to me, enraging, because when I think about right now, I've got an okay situation where I'm teaching at a school where I think that I'll be able to teach for a while. But if I were not in that situation right now, because I was 2 years ago, I was all the way, I couldn't get any adjunct jobs, and I was teaching for Kaplan doing SAT courses, which are the worst thing you could possibly do. I mean, they just fucking rip you off. It's the worst thing. Literally, no money there. So that was the rock bottom for me. And I'm like, is this going to be like the last thing I do as a teacher? Am I going to, because I was really close to honestly going and applying at Lowe's, which is a warehouse tool store like Home Depot. Because I was like, hey, they'll pay
Walmart.
They'll pay $18 an hour and I can maybe get enough money to pay the rent. And like that's where we're at. And like that shit is, to me, you know, a failure. And when I talk about this to older people, like I mean like boomers, it's like they look at me like they don't fucking believe me. You know what I mean? Like they're just like, what are you talking about? If you have a PhD, you're rich.
I know. Even young folks who just like aren't involved in the academy. I mean, people my age who like have sort of no idea about like academic labor and politics and stuff. Like they, you know, it's easy for people to just be casually impressed with a PhD when, you know, and it is enraging in part because it's such a waste of resources. Like you, in order to facilitate this like messed up, flexible, you know, production in the academy, you are essentially like taking all of the public resources that went into training these people over a period of years and just tossing it out the window. Because, you know, you have these people who are absolute like experts in their field. They're at the terminal point at which like you can be an expert in something, and there's still no work, right? Which is sort of getting at the point when you brought up Lowe's. I mean, the reason why it's important to be thinking about the gig economy and academia together is because like they are the same, like the workforces are merging. Yeah. Right. So like PhDs are just as likely to end up being, you know, working on these platforms, you know, doing side hustles, cobbling together, doing, you know, sex workers, like all, you know, people have had to do all kinds of things. And, you know, it's not that, you know, working in the academy is like working for Uber. It's literally the same workforce, like increasingly. And the people that have side hustles that are not in the academy, I think you're going to see that a lot more. Yeah. And you know, the problem is that we've always conceived as having our own unique sets of problems with neoliberalism to fight in the academy. And while that may be true, like the point is that what's happening in the academy is part of what's happening everywhere. And what makes the gig economy significant is like we have finally sort of normalized the fact that you can be, you know, absolutely contingent and do work that is, you know, of the highest like expertise and quality and, you know, that requires tons and tons of training. Because, right, we're at the end of this process where, you know, higher ed has successfully manufactured its own reserve army of workers. And, you know, just like the factories used to, right? It was all about having these people on hand, like as needed, on demand. And the precarity is really the key to how they're able to exploit you. Yeah. I mean, that's the key to the control. But the other thing is, I mean, the gig academy does, you know, a lot of other things that it shares, right? So the scientific management piece is important, right? Unbundling faculty roles into their like constituent parts. And after you've like disassembled the various pieces, farming them out individually at cheaper rates. And that's a really important part of it. There's a term called the fissured workplace too. And this gets at another really important point, which is that it's not just academic workers, right? It's everyone on campus. It's clerical workers, dining, housing, maintenance, tech workers, right? Like all of these people used to work for the university. And there was some like pride and dignity in that, even if you were, you know, even if you were just a janitor or whatever, you worked for the university. And so your family got, you know, tuition remission if your kids like wanted to go there. There were other like benefits. That sounds like stuff that goes into that public good category. Yeah, and with that gone, you're right. I mean, the people that do the landscaping, everyone at this, I'm teaching at a big 4-year public research university, and everyone is contracted out. They wear uniforms from different companies as they're at the school. Right. Yeah. And that's exactly the point, right? This is a really important piece, which is that by fissuring, by taking each of these non-essential sort of functions and farming them out to third-party contractors, right? So like none of your dining workers work for you anymore. They work for Cisco, and none of your maintenance workers work for you because they work for this other firm that just like provides a sort of endless supply of part-time labor to sweep and mop things. That suddenly, right, you decentered the university in the event that there's any kind of boss fight, and it makes it extremely hard, right? And they know this. It makes it hard to target them, in the event of a labor dispute, because now, and a good example of this is the Justice for Janitors movement in the early 90s, which actually took place at USC and was a sort of early example of like really interesting and impressive sort of broad-based organizing happening on college campuses to defend, right, a non-academic population of workers. And so it was like unions and immigrant groups and students and faculty, and there were just like a lot of different people coming together to pressure the university, who was trying. That's exactly what they were doing, was attempting to outsource all of their maintenance staff, and they did ultimately. And Justice for Janitors sort of was a success because the janitors did unionize. But, right, once they unionized, they weren't bargaining with the university. They were bargaining with this other, company that they worked for now. So that ends up like, it's this way to like alleviate the pressure and like help prevent, all of these like key populations of workers from developing solidarity with one another and wielding that power sort of effectively against them. It also lets them obscure their own kind of, complacency with like, structural racism and other things, because they can strategically count, right? Because these people no longer, work for them. They don't have to sort of incorporate them into their calculations of, diversity, statistics. And, like Amazon does this where sort of in the other way where, Amazon will, report its diversity numbers and they look great in the pie chart. But then, the reality is that among the people who make a living wage at Amazon, right, it's overwhelmingly white and male, they're counting all the warehouse workers too.
Yeah.
They're just like lumping everyone together. And the Academy can do that as well because, the data shows that, the professoriate is getting more diverse. There are more women and more people of color as college professors, not on the tenure track though.
Right.
That growth has happened exclusively off the tenure track for the most part. And maybe there are individual exceptions, but, on the whole. So it's, it allows for these similar sorts of things. The shifting of risk onto the workers themselves, right? That's another key piece. The way that Uber drivers, are responsible for the maintenance of their vehicle and the gas and like everything that happens. They have to pay a certain amount just to be eligible to do the work. And obviously adjuncts, it's the same thing. People have to like, drive all over creation because they're teaching at like 2 or 3 different universities. And they have to, bring their own supplies.
I gotta pay for parking, dude. The parking situation, they charge us, faculty parking sticker is $110 a semester. So it's like so it's just like right out of the gate, like I'm not even gonna get paid very much. Like my paycheck every month is $900 and then $110 in parking right away, like shit like that. It's just like, holy shit, you just took more than a tenth of my paycheck for just like paying for the privilege of parking my car at the fucking place I work. It's insane. Like there's so many things like that are like ways for them to push those costs onto us. It's part of stuff. I mean, I tweet about this stuff every time it happens, but it's just kind of like there's so many little bits like that, like little examples of the larger trend you're describing in this book and at the Gig Academy, which is like the whole system is designed this way, and like that part of it, I think is really dangerous because it's like we have now a generation of young people who are normalized, so that's how it works.
Yeah. And
like the university used to be a place where you could go and escape all the fucking nasty shit about capitalism. And now it's exactly the same. Like the consumer element of it, the kind of exchange element, all the alienation of capitalism, all the alienation you feel at the shopping mall or any kind of like institutional consumer exchange is duplicated at the Academy. And that part of it is like really depressing because the people that really got into the university, like us, like we had other ideas of what it could be and what its purpose is.
Yeah, and honestly, the like one of the Oh, sorry.
Right.
One of the examples of that perfectly is the sort of compulsory nature of entrepreneurialism and self-branding, right? That has
The hustle.
Right, and like even when you're an academic, as a grad student, like I have been under pressure to develop essentially like a brand, right? Like, I mean, what if of course that's basically what it is to sort of find your like research specialty, right? To find your little sub field to burrow and make a hole and be like the expert in, and hope that that will sort of carry you. Like there's a lot of pressure to produce things that will have proprietary value
but yeah, that branding thing and hustle thing is like American individualist ideology at its like most 21st century. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like the idea of like branding yourself as an influencer or something like that. I talk to students, all the time. I teach. I'm in the classroom like all the time, and I tell students about. I mean, they live in this world. They're already kind of applying for things. They're already doing this stuff. I ask them like, how many of you have done an interview on Skype? They all have. So they're like in this world where they're kind of like they know what it is. And part of what I see as my job in some ways is like to let them know, like give them hints on how to improve their hustle. But like that part of me is because I'm doing it. You know what I mean? Like I'm doing it and I'm like, hey, this works. You need to like make contact with people that can help you. I mean, there's so many different like elements of like literally navigating your ability to survive in the American economy. And that part of it seems like it's increasingly like all anyone wants to talk about is how you can kind of put together a life. And the idea that we tell our students that they need to brand themselves, that's so depressing, dude. That's like the ultimate American ideology.
Yeah, but it's at every level, right? It's undergraduates and graduates.
Yeah, we're all doing it.
Faculty, like we all have to be our own company, right? That is the way to succeed and get noticed. And so you end up having to give over a lot of free labor, of course, to like make that happen. And and that's sort of like almost a trite point about neoliberalism in general, the fact that like we're all reduced to being individual brands, but it's an important one.
Honestly, isn't that why part of why Bernie is saying not me, us is like, I think part of the reason that resonates is because there's this feeling that you're alone. And a lot of people, as much as we like all are hustling and branding and stuff, it's a deeply alienating society, a deeply alienating thing to think that we all are on our own.
And as a workplace, it's incredibly atomizing, right? Like I trying to organize a grad union at a place like USC is extremely difficult, if only because of the way that like the population of grad workers is so scattered and so like fragmented, and much of it takes place, behind keypad doors in buildings that you never go in.
Right.
It operates much more like a sort of like, a corporate park where there's, a lot of different private companies doing their own thing. Like, they have this sort of like sports identity that ties them all together. But in reality, I think it's called like responsibility centered budgeting, where like each individual school basically like runs its own thing and then just like pays rent to the overarching university.
Wow.
It makes it really hard, and that's part of the point too. It makes it hard when you can fissure the workforce and create lots of different bosses that people are accountable to, and like isolate people in these like different loci of work, and atomize them from each other, like within that work, which is what happens to a lot of PhDs. It just makes it extremely difficult to organize, and this is sort of true with like Uber too, where like everyone is in their own little pod, driving around. There's no like break room. Although
it's awful, dude. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say an interesting development was the way that unions like SEIU out here is in addition to organizing grad workers and non-tenure track faculty and such, they're also working on rideshare drivers and platform workers. And they figured out that they can go hang out at LAX
Yeah.
And there is a very large population of folks who have gathered like in the cell lot to, and so that was actually a way to like talk to lots of workers. I thought it was sort of a clever strategy. But
well, speaking of clever strategies, I mean, we kind of got to wrap it up. But I want to know what I want to know is like kind of what was when you wrote this book with two other people at USC, and what was your hope? In other words, what audience are you aiming for? Who do you want to read this book, and what do you want us to do? Because
yeah, I think we want people to recognize the scale of the problem in a new way, right? Like creating this concept is a way of trying to like update the discourse to say like, okay, we find ourselves fully in this new reality, right? It's no longer that like these neoliberal things are taking over and they need to be fought. Like they are the system now.
Right.
And it's been that way. And so the only way, like we have to stop trying to just sort of like, make these moral appeals to leaders to fix things. Like we have to, as we are trying to do, many of us in lots of other domains in society right now, like we have to just wage, bottom up struggle. And the interesting thing about that is, like workplace democracy is, a movement sort of everywhere and it's important, but, academia is the one, and this is, I think, not the nostalgia trap. Right. The nostalgia trap is to say we need to go back to these like things that, were once so good for everybody. Right. But to say, the interesting point is that academia is the one workplace in the United States where it was at least like an acceptable idea that workplace democracy was an important part of the structure of that institution, that like it's regardless of the reality, right? The fact that people accepted the notion that this was one workplace where democracy made sense, at least in theory, right? It says, is way more than any other workplace, right, has been given.
Right. Like the idea that factory workers had some sort of democratic right to control their workplace was something that's an extremely radical idea that never really, took off. It only took off through like real struggle. But like I never really thought about it that way. That like the idea that the workers, the labor, the professors, the teachers at colleges would have some part of the governance of the school as a more natural idea, that seems like something to return to.
Right, and it's not actually returning, right? It's waging like a new struggle. Like the university that we all want is one that has never existed. Like we have to build it from scratch.
I love that. That's such a great idea, dude. That's so good. Yeah.
And the and it's not actually like we can democratize this, and it's not even like the old ideas of shared governance. You have some universities now that are like, oh well, we like have a couple of adjunct representatives like in our curriculum committee. As though that is sort of like, bringing this workforce like meaningful like representation, in guiding the affairs of the school. That's not the case. Like I think we have to go well beyond that and find entirely new ways to democratize the operations of universities. And that has to be done through collective struggle. And that has to be done by forming such chains of solidarity across all of these strata. Like we can't just, focus on the adjunct problem or even just like adjuncts and grad students, or even like all contingent instruction and researchers. Like we have to look at the entire higher ed apparatus. We have to look at academic production in general, like all the ways that it is sustained in all these awful ways, and we have to find a collective way to hold it to hold it hostage, to hold the production process itself hostage until we can fix some of these things. And and to give you like a little example of what you're talking about, of that kind of like how we would need to build like kind of across class solidarity within the university, maybe outside of the academy too, and outside. That's the general strike idea, because we're talking about Uber driver, like how we're basically all in the same economy. I love that. I love that idea. But like at the PSC, the CUNY's latest contract, dude. So like the adjuncts got fucked over. It's like $4,500 or something like that. They were asking for $7,000. There was an adjunct movement that was like a radical movement that was like, we're going to try and pressure people and tenured faculty to like vote no on the contract, etc. That movement failed, and the adjunct movement for $7,000 failed within this latest contract dispute, in part because
the workers that are like janitorial staff and food worker staff, etc., they were saying to the adjuncts, what the fuck, why aren't you fighting for us? So in other words, like it was like the adjuncts saying to tenured faculty, what the fuck, why aren't you fighting for us? And then and then down the chain of like janitorial staff saying what the fuck to the adjuncts. So in other words, like exactly what you're describing, the fact that we're like atomized, there are walls around, like between us, that's intentional. That's like when I see the janitorial staff fighting with the adjunct and the adjuncts fighting with tenure, etc., I'm like, dude, this is exactly what they want. This is the capitalist academy. This is the plan, is to kind of keep this these classes from really creating that solidarity.
And so, because the professional distance once thought to exist between, a professional, historian, Ph.D. who happens to be off the tenure track, and, say a campus like dining hall worker, is largely symbolic anymore. Like, that's why we have to, it is, you're right. It's not just about the academy. That's why the talking about these like platform capitalist firms in relation to this is key, because it is the same workforce and it's being restructured in the same way. And so for what it's worth, though, I mean, half of all, there was a new study that just came out looking at all the academic strikes in the last, I think, 2012 to 2018. And there have been 42 strikes in total. Half of those were non-academic workers.
Wow.
On campus.
That's great.
But the heartening thing too is that, I mean, these are increasing in frequency, right? Like the number doubled from 2017 to 2018. You're seeing like much more sort of militant organizing at the graduate level. You're seeing much more kind of social justice unionism. Like a lot of these folks are like pushing unions to adopt more of a rank and file strategy, to focus more on broad-based organizing. And that's going to be the key to winning ultimately. And I'm heartened at least that, because for a while it was like teachers carried the mantle of the strike as a weapon. For so long, like no one struck really except for teachers. And it's finally like starting to spread outward again, right? Of course in K-12 you have like the teachers in all these red states who are banned, and you have grad workers going on wildcat strikes and all these things, but it's finally spreading. Tech workers are striking, journalists, and
it's a new era for labor for sure.
Right, it's coming back into, and like the more that this starts to spread, I think like we only need a very like minimum threshold where we can demonstrate a proof of concept, right?
Yeah.
Where we can do this, like the Jane McAlevey and the structural test, right? Theory. Like we just have to get to that floor where we can actually demonstrate what this power can bring. And then, I feel like it will click.
Yeah.
It will have to click for a lot of people who have struggled to figure out how to achieve political change, in part by, navigating the labyrinthian halls of power and trying to like convince the right people to like ease up on some particular things, like tweaking around the edges. People will finally be like, oh, actually this works.
Yeah.
And we can wield this power effectively.
That's the hope. And I think that, what you said earlier about the university, I think it applies to the labor movement as well, which is that, the labor movement we want hasn't existed yet. Right. And like hasn't and the one that we need to build for the 21st century may look very different than the labor movements of the past. Not that we won't be building on a lot of the same structures. It's still capitalism. It's still a lot of the same kind of ideological parameters are still there. But the idea that there's more people, like more teachers and janitors looking at each other and realizing that there are no walls between them, that's such a fucking critical moment. And it is an exciting one. Tom DePaola, thank you so much for explaining the Gig Academy. I feel like we could talk more. Maybe we should do a bonus episode.
I could talk more about the city stuff and gentrification, because I think that's like a really sort of underappreciated dimension of like why universities do what they do.
We can have you back
next time. My next book will be about that. So
something not so grim, or maybe grim in a different way.
Grim in a different way,
not
right?
so personally grim.
Because the gig economy is changing the city itself, right?
Yeah.
The gig economy is trying to make the city more amenable to the kind of frictionless transactions that it thrives on.
Yeah.
And universities are helping that, right? They're helping to affect this transition in all kinds of important ways.
Bro, I was at NYU for a couple years. Seeing that like kind of synergy between kind of capital outside the university and capital inside the university is really ripe there. And that shit, it's a whole other episode. I was thinking maybe we could do a bonus episode behind the paywall, so we can talk about some of the more thorny solutions and problems we're dealing with here. But again, Tom DePaola, I really appreciate you talking to me. Go get for those that are interested in this stuff, go get The Gig Academy. I think it's a book that explains in very, very clear and practical terms what's going on and some ideas of what we can do about it. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. My Twitter's LA Tom Fidential, and my co-authors are Daniel Scott Says and Adrianna Kezar. Those are their handles. The Pullius Center for Higher Education is housed at USC. That's what we work for. The Delphi project on the changing faculty and student success has done, is responsible for a lot of the research on how this like impacts students negatively. You can check that stuff out. Also, if you're in grad school or thinking about going to grad school, I challenge you to please read the Bousquet book, How the University Works, and read Sarah Ahmed's book on Being Included, which is another, I think, really critical glance at how like this whole apparatus is designed to be exclusionary. And read everything that Max Alvarez has written, The Chronicle and The Baffler.
Yeah, totally. And understand that if you're going into grad school, like you be aware. I wish someone had told me that you're going into a battle, and you're going to a battle that's like a really important one. And that part of it, I think, is more and more the responsibility I see of being an academic. So
it's not about convincing you not to go. It's convincing you to go and join the struggle, be part of the struggle, right?
Yeah, dude. Okay, huge thank you to my guest, Tom DePaola. I had a great time talking about The Gig Academy. It is fucking depressing and enraging shit, but it's really the fight of our lives. And I don't know what's going to happen at the University of La Verne, where I'm at. We've got the vote of no confidence. We've got the adjuncts getting together, meeting in Starbucks to figure out if we can make a union. But the energy is there. The outrage is there. I think more people than ever, including the key constituency, tenured faculty, are beginning to understand how fucked we are if we don't stand up to the administrations that are attacking us like this. So, with that in mind, good luck with wherever you are, and let's talk more about all of this. Please support our program if you can. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks so much for the people that are subscribing, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care.